Okay, we'll call the 9th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance to order. Monsieur Carrier, point of order, Mr.
Oui. Avant que l'on commence notre séance.
Before we start our session, I have here a copy of a letter that the chair of the permanent committee sent you on the 13th of February last concerning the Act for the Protection of Navigable Waters, which is mentioned in C10. And he proposed a common activity. He said that potential witnesses could be called so that both committees could have a common hearing to study this bill coming from the Department of Transport. I have received a copy of this letter this morning, but we haven't had an answer from you about the possibility of this joint meeting. Since our spokesperson for transport was not called for this evening session, I wondered what was your answer to this request of a joint meeting. I see that certain representatives of the Transport Committee are present this evening, but we in the Bloc were not advised of a joint session. So what did you decide on this point?
Would you like to address this?
Thank you, Mr. Carrier. It was me that sent the letter, and the correspondence between the clerks suggested, because of the time restraints, that if a member from the Transport Committee chose to participate, that through the committee, I see Mr. Volpe's here. Obviously, Mr. Carrier, you have a lot of experience on that committee. The message I got was if you wanted to be at the committee, you should try and sub in or out. I regret that Mr. Laframboise, if he wanted to be here, couldn't be here.
But from a finance point of view, what we tried to do was to have one session dedicated to navigable waters, and obviously members are free to substitute in or out. It was my understanding that this is how it was handled in the last session of Parliament with respect to the immigration provisions of Bill C-50.
What I was mentioning was that we were not informed of the discussions, of these joint discussions that were held. And our transport critic, Mr. Mario Laframboise, was not invited to come to this session this evening. And for the NDP, I don't know if they had better communication, but, you know, I'm no longer on the Transport Committee. It's not up to me to decide for them. And I found it very interesting that there was a joint session of both committees.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to advise Mr. Carrier and all members that I never received an invitation either. I wanted to show up because I have an interest in this particular file from an environmental perspective, but certainly this isn't a joint meeting as far as I'm aware. If it is, I'm not aware of that, because certainly I just found out a minute ago that one of the members didn't show up and I've been signed in, but other than that I'm just coming as an observer. So that was my intention to do so, and I'm certain he was aware that the meeting was taking place, the finance meeting was taking place, and this was on the agenda, which is why I'm here today. So, not certain, but...
Mr. Speaker, I'd really deplore the fact that this information was not communicated to all parties to allow us to have the opportunity of inviting our respective spokespersons to discuss this point. Simply for your information on this point, we were never informed of this suggestion, of even the suggestion that there be a joint session. I regret the fact that my colleague, who has more experience than I do in the transport field, was not able to be here.
Transport subcommittee where this was discussed. My understanding, it was a transport subcommittee, and a member from each political party was there. It was not from the full transport committee with respect of a joint meeting with the full Finance Committee. With respect to the agenda here today, it was my understanding as the chair that members, even before the Budget Implementation Act was passed, wanted the Finance Committee to study this issue expeditiously, which is why we even started infrastructure prior to the passing of the Budget Implementation Act, and that this was a priority of this committee, and that's how I proceeded. If the committee wants to proceed, I guess we would wait for a full motion from the full Transport Committee to study this item, and if they want to hold a joint committee in the future, that's up to this committee and up to the Transport Committee. But it was from the subcommittee of the Transport Committee, the chair wrote it, and I understand that all members, or all four political parties were represented at that subcommittee. But this is a Finance Committee meeting at which members are free to substitute in or out if they have an interest in this particular issue. Okay. Thank you. We will get now to the agenda. We have 6 organizations, or 6, 1 individual and 5 organizations here for this hour-and-a-half panel. We have, first of all, the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. We have, secondly, Lake Ontario Waterkeeper. We have, thirdly, Canoe Kayak Canada. We have, as an individual, we have Mr. Jack McLaren. Fifthly, we have the University of Ottawa is here represented. And then sixthly, we have the Department of Transport represented. So if I can ask each of you to do an opening statement of not more than 5 minutes, and we will go down in that order, and then we will go to questions from members. So, Mr. Ferrand, if we can begin with you and work our way down the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. On behalf of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, our 100,000 members and supporters and 655 member clubs across the province of Ontario, I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you this evening on certain aspects of Bill C-10, the Budget Implementation Act. Let me be clear that we understand that the recent budget, and this bill in particular, are born out of a necessity for the government to respond quickly and decisively to the current economic circumstances facing both the Canadian and global economies. In that respect, we commend the government for their actions and in particular for their attempts through the budget to remove impediments to moving forward with critical programs. We do, however, have a number of concerns relating specifically to the sections of C-10 that deal with proposed amendments to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. In our view, some of the proposed amendments have the potential to dramatically alter the ability of Canadians to continue accessing and using thousands of miles of waterways currently protected under the Act. These same amendments could impact negatively on fish habitat, fish passage, and recreational sport fishing, which contributes over $3.5 billion annually to the Canadian economy. In Canada, the use of rivers and streams for commerce and recreational purposes is a fundamental part of our economic and social fabric. The ability to use our waterways helped to build this nation. While the waterways may not today be the highways or lifeline of commerce that they once were, they are nonetheless essential to a host of economic and social activities that are essential to the well-being of Canadian businesses, individuals, and communities. In the process of trying to bolster some aspects of the economy and put people back to work, it is imperative that the government does not eliminate the critical checks and balances that protect other elements of the economy and the way of life of Canadians. It is essential that in fixing some problems, we do not create unforeseen economic, social, and environmental problems that will live with us far beyond the current economic crisis. We believe some of the proposed changes to the NWPA have this potential. I won't bother with a great deal of history on the NWPA. Most of you are familiar with that, and we have limited time here. Navigability in Canada is both a question of law and of fact. To be navigable in law, a watercourse in question must be navigable in fact. Navigability is in fact demonstrated if a waterway is used or capable of being used by the public as a water highway, for lack of a better term. In essence, the test developed in Canada is one of public utility. If a waterway has real or potential practical value to the public as a means of travel or transport from one point of public access to another, it is considered to be navigable. Equal if it serves or is capable of serving a legitimate public interest in that it is or could be regularly and profitably used by the public for some socially beneficial activity, recreational fishing, for example, it must be regarded as navigable land within the public domain and continue to be protected as such. To provide a balanced view of our changes to the proposed changes to the NWPA, I would be remiss if I did not point out that we do believe there are several positive proposed changes to the Act. These include the proposal to strengthen enforcement and compliance provisions, including fines, appointments, and powers of officers. We also understand and support the government's efforts to remove some of the barriers to economic development by attempting to minimize red tape. In particular, we support the efforts to provide for a single approvals process for related projects. And thirdly, we support the concept of classifying works, and in the case of minor works, developing standards of construction, placement, operation, safety, and removal, providing that there is a concerted effort to enforce these provisions. However, we have major concerns and must strongly oppose proposed changes to the NWPA that would provide for the classification and potential declassification of navigable waters. In specific, I'm speaking to sections 5.1.1, sections 12.1, 13.1, and 14.1 are all of concern since they provide for the classification of navigable waters. We do support the concept of classifying works and types of projects and providing for the development of standards for specific projects of works that are of a minor nature. For instance, floating docks, diving platforms, whatnot. Both the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans have been working towards a system where it is possible to simplify approvals for minor works. However, the classification of what constitutes a navigable water is extremely problematic, particularly if it provides the potential to declassify or diminish any existing or potential navigable waters. Because the proposed amendments are not clear in this regard, the potential to declassify navigable waters therefore exists. This is a major concern to us and to other users of Canada's waterways in terms of public access and the use and protection of the fishery. Recognizing that we are under time limitations, we therefore propose the following two recommendations. Given that the government will be reviewing both the Environmental Assessment Act and the Fisheries Act, we strongly recommend that the proposed amendments to the NWPA be decoupled from Bill C-10 and that they be considered in concert with a review of these other acts later this year, and that a more fulsome review and public consultation process, particularly regarding the classification of navigable waters, be included in that review. Failing that, we recommend that amendments to the NWPA be generally approved with the exception that the reference to the concept of classifying navigable waters be completely removed from the proposed amendments. If this alternative is adopted, there should be a further clarification of the wording of the revised Act, confirming that nothing in the Act is intended to reduce or abrogate the responsibility of the Minister to ensure that the impacts of development on navigability, public use of waterways, and the environment are fully considered.
Okay.
In closing, if I may say, Mr. Chair, in this context, it is important that the government not only do the right thing, but also be seen to doing the right thing. And in our view, amendments to the NWPA, which may be long overdue, have no place in this bill. And I thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now go, Mr. Matson, will you be presenting?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I know how short your time is and how important your time is, and we'll try and keep to it within the 5 minutes. I'm president of Lake Ontario Waterkeeper. We represent waterkeeper organizations from British Columbia right to Labrador. And I'm joined here with my Vice President, Kristen Tully, and the Ottawa Riverkeeper, Meredith Brown. Two points, really, that I hope that you take home with you tonight about the changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. If the changes are approved, two things will happen, basically. And that first will be that it'll no longer be a right in Canada that the government, when it wants to take away the rights to navigation, it needs to get the consent of the people. And secondly, the government will no longer be required to do its due diligence before infringing upon those rights of navigation. Both of those rights or obligations that are currently protected under the Navigable Waters Protection Act are now being retermed or rephrased as being no longer important, old, outdated. We know
from our relations with hunting community, paddling community, fishing community, tourism community, right across this country, that that's not true. These are not outdated rights and principles, and the people still require that this government, its elected officials, or the actual public servants are required to get the consent of the people and to do its due diligence before it takes away or infringes on those navigable water rights.
There are four changes that we are specifically concerned about. The elimination of the environmental assessment trigger is one. Exempting whole classes of waterways from scientific study or public review is another. Exempting whole classes of projects as well as waterways is a third. And minimizing public notice and consultation when making decisions that affect navigation rights is a fourth. These changes mean reduced transparency in decision-making. They mean a loss of valuable scientific review, and they mean the elimination of parliamentary oversight from one of our most important laws. Waterkeepers, we live our lives on the water, from British Columbia to Ontario to Newfoundland and Labrador. We know the history behind this law because we live this history. First and foremost, navigation is a right enjoyed by every individual. It's not a privilege that's been given to us by government. And to date, no Western democracy has ever taken this right away from its people. The current Act recognizes this and requires that governments seek the public's consent and advice every time they infringe upon our rights. The new Act says we can't afford to do this. We don't have the resources. We need regulatory efficiency in the name of economic development. And that's not true. The current Act gives the Minister and the Ministry of Transportation all the authority it needs to exempt small projects. It doesn't apply to waters that aren't navigable. It doesn't apply to projects that don't interfere with navigation. Not only are the amendments overkill and unnecessary, they won't even accomplish the goals that they are supposed to. It eliminates the rights for the public, but at the same time it offloads oversight and accountability to politicians, to provincial governments, to municipal governments. The work doesn't go away. It just gets passed to somebody else. It centralizes decision-making in Ottawa, so bureaucrats here will tell people in Alberta and Quebec what will happen on their waterways. And the people who live in those communities and know the waterways better will not have an opportunity or a forum to be heard, to present science, or to help make decisions better. It creates piecemeal protections that will protect some communities at the expense of others. Some communities in Canada will have rights and privileges that others do not enjoy. There is an attempt here to address some of the economic concerns, and we're well aware of what those are. But at the same time, it's granting opportunities to one group at the expense of another. And it's going to hurt hunting and fishing, tourism, outfitters, the First Nations and small businesses, the people who rely on these rivers for their livelihood. We appreciate the opportunity and the privilege to speak to the committee today, and we urge you to remember the thousands of people who can't be here tonight, the other waterkeepers, the First Nations, the hunters, the paddlers. For the record, we do want to say we do not believe that there has been adequate consultation at all. There are so many people who still need to be consulted, including in your ridings at home. And we apologize that we're here at the 11th hour pointing out major flaws in this important piece of legislation. We wish we had an opportunity to be part of a fulsome consultation prior to tonight, but this is where we are. We're bringing forward the best available research to let you know that the Navigable Waters Protection Act amendments that are in Bill C-10 are going to pose a huge problem and create administrative burdens and centralized decision-making in the future, and to ask that you consider them separately from the finance bill, maybe as part of the environmental assessment review that's coming up later this spring, and through the Transport Committee and through the Environment Department.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations. We'll go now to Canoe Kayak Canada, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Edwards. I'm Domestic Development Director of Canoe Kayak Canada, and I'm joined by Anne Merklinger, Director General of Canoe Kayak Canada. We are an organization with 50,000 members in Canada. We are one of Canada's oldest sporting organizations, founded in 1900, and we are the organization that is responsible for putting Olympic athletes on the podium for Canada at Olympic Games, whether they be in the sport of flatwater canoeing, marathon canoeing, or whitewater canoeing. We are also a regular attendee at the annual meetings of the Canadian Marine Advisory Council, and we are on the Standing Committee on Recreational Boating to advise the Office of Boating Safety and ultimately Transport Canada on issues of safety
with regard to recreational boating in Canada. We take those responsibilities very seriously. There are 3 key points, and I will point out that there is a handout that the committee members have received. I'm not going to speak directly to that. That has more detail. There are 3 key points we wish to communicate this evening. First of all, the Canadian identity is entirely wrapped up with the rivers of Canada. As has been pointed out, it is considered a birthright of Canadians. It is founded in the deepest traditions of our common law. The common law combined beautifully with the Aboriginal considerations for access to the waters of Canada. In a unique way, we have combined the heritages of 2 of the main peoples of Canada. I ask you the question, with this heritage which is so important, will the iPod generations know nothing of the old Canada? Surely not. Are the rivers of Canada in the way of the new Canada? Are they barriers? Surely not. There is an economic aspect to this. There is a new and emerging tourism economy in Canada. The Act did not foresee that when it was originally drafted, but that is surely the case today. Canoe and kayaking touring and ecotourism has become a major part of the economic life of much of rural Canada. Rural Canada struggles to find economic purpose in this country. Please don't take another piece of economic development away from rural Canada. Lastly, and most importantly, safety. Ladies and gentlemen, obstructions are hazards by definition. They are threats to life and limb. How will the public be warned about hazards on newly non-navigable waterways? Will there be signs up at every point of public access to the newly non-navigable waterways? Safety issues need to be thoroughly reviewed in this matter. We're not confident that that has been the case. In closing, we and the members of Canoe Kayak Canada wish that the Government of Canada, like all taxpayers, operates in the most efficient and focused manner in order that we can have the best government at the minimal cost. There appear to be anecdotal examples where the NWPA has been carried too far in its implementation. We would be pleased to work with the government and other stakeholders on the above-noted issues to ensure the NWPA is applied appropriately in the 21st century. We don't think this has ever been done with Canada's paddling communities. We think the committee members are well aware of what an effective and full public consultation is, after having just gone through an election. We are also well aware of the need for the government to expedite infrastructure spending in the near term of 2 years. We respectfully suggest the Budget Implementation Act of 2009 be amended to permit Transport Canada to retain additional staff to expedite these approvals. Finally, we recommend the NWPA amendment section of the bill be removed from the Budget Implementation Act of 2009 so that a proper consultation can occur. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. We'll go now to Mr. McLaren, please.
Thank you, sir. My name is Jack McLaren. I own a small farm outside of Renfrew in Ontario. I have ran into trouble with the Drainage Act and the Navigable Waters Act. If you could imagine, on my farm there's a similar to a bowl. Like if you can imagine these desks being about 400 to 500 yards long, a small mud hole in one end where all the drainage goes into that, and a ditch that we have dug over to a point, and it filters into the ground. There must be holes in rock or something there. So last year, without my permission, the beavers moved in. Normally this goes totally dry. The beavers moved in and they dammed this thing up. So it flooded my lawn, flooded a large piece of land that I was going to plant apple trees on, which I can't because apple trees don't like wet feet. But in wanting to correct this situation, I phoned a gentleman that owns Hi-Hos. The first thing he asked me was if I had a permit. I said, it's totally on my land. I don't need a permit. He said, you do. I will be fined. I forget the amount of money he would be fined, and so will you. So I checked with another one. Same thing. So here I have this flooded land, my lawn flooded, a little piece of creek, probably 300, not a creek, a ditch, 300 feet long, and I can't get it cleaned out because of the Drainage Act and the Navigable Waters Act. Now I have pictures in here, which I can't show you, of a gentleman standing in the water, and the water took a picture of his feet. The water is over the top of the toes of his rubber boots. But I cannot clean that out. I had to go to, firstly, I phoned M&R, and they sent a gentleman down, and he told me I had to go Fisheries and Oceans. Now, don't forget, this is entirely in front of, on my farm, in front of my house. It's probably 400 to 500 yards long. I cannot remove that to my land without Fisheries and Oceans came from Prescott. He had no problems with it. I had a problem getting him to send me a letter okaying this. So now I'm supposed to go back to M&R in Pembroke, apply for a permit, get it from them. Now, this is coming on fall, and as you all know, where the water seeps into the ground, it disappears. It's in the bowl. It disappears inside that area. When it freezes, the water no longer can get away from there. So it's too late by that time for me to get a permit, to get the work done. So I am stuck with a little piece of ditch totally on my property, and I think they're calling it a navigable waterway. This is the most stupid piece of legislation. I guess I'm not supposed to use that terminology here, but it is the most stupid piece of legislation I have seen. It's under the Navigable Waters Act. The water that is down past the Beaver Dam wouldn't come over the toes of your boots. But I still have to go through this. Now, I would like for this to, the Drainage Act be scrapped, the Navigable Waters Act be scrapped on private land. Because I'm sure all of you gentlemen don't want to come into a mud hole that they would sink out of sight on my farm and go fishing, because there's no fish there. So I would like this totally scrapped. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. McLaren. And Mr. Amos, will you be presenting on behalf of the University of Ottawa?
I'll have to explain. In fact, I will be presenting on behalf of a number of different groups. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members, for having us here. My name is Will Amos. I'm staff counsel with the University of Ottawa and Eco-Justice Environmental Law Clinic, so I'm an environmental lawyer by trade. Today I'll be representing a variety of ecotourism, paddling, environmental, and outfitter groups. Among the groups that I'm speaking for today include Mountain Equipment Co-op with its several million members, Sierra Club of Canada, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, the West Coast Environmental Law Association, Fondation Rivière, Nature Canada and some of its affiliates, the Canada Rivers Network with 35 groups underneath it, which include a number of outfitters and ecotourism enterprises. So effectively, I'm speaking for a large number of groups here, and I wouldn't characterize my remarks as strictly coming from the environmental community, quote unquote. I think to start, I'd simply like to point out a very important statistic, and that is that Census Canada, or the Census report from 2003, indicated that 2.3 million Canadians paddle every year. This is a lot of Canadians. This is an act that actually impacts upon many interests. These are real people, real voters, real interests. There are a number of issues that I'm going to try to raise. Some of them have been touched upon by my fellow presenters, and I do hope that we get to touch upon them in the question period. But the main points that I'd like to make today are the following. Number one, fundamental changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act and to protection afforded to the public's navigation rights should not be bundled into a budget bill. And they do require an adequate consultation process. And we would posit that the process of consultation was simply not adequate last spring. The groups that I am representing, the dozens of groups that I'm representing, were not contacted, were not aware, were not able to make comments. And I would hazard a guess that if they had been consulted, that the bill or the amendments proposed might have been better. A streamlined NWPA might have been improved. Secondly, the amendments that are proposed would weaken the right of navigation, sacrifice outdoor recreation opportunities. They would compromise the federal environmental assessment role through the use of non-transparent ministerial exemption provisions. And as well, I'd like to spend some time today, if time permits, exposing what we perceive to be the myth of environmental overlap and duplication with the provinces. First off, I'd like to say that many of the groups I represent would have loved to have appeared last spring. They weren't invited to the Transport Committee hearings. I understand the Transport Committee did consider a cross-country tour. That would have been a fabulous idea, and I think there are a lot of paddling groups who operate at the local level who would have greatly appreciated that. And while I'm grateful for the opportunity to make last-minute representations on behalf of these organizations, this does not compensate in any way, shape, or form for the inadequate opportunities that there were last spring. So thank you for the opportunity, but we would like to do this again. Our main ask at the end of the day is going to be that, as other groups have mentioned, that the proposed amendments be removed from Bill C-10 and that they be rediscussed in the context of the broader a broader reform initiative of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. We understand that the government is proposing reforms. The Navigable Water Protection Act amendments speak directly to those reforms of environmental assessment. We believe they should be discussed in the same context at the same time, and that will yield a more effective series of changes. I think that if the federal environmental role in protecting the public right of navigation is to be transformed, it does behoove the government to follow a normal legislative process. The tabling of a bill that's tabled, that can be examined by civil society, that can be discussed before committee, not a process where no bill is in front of an incomplete group of civil society. And I think that in the context of discussing our request that these proposed amendments be withdrawn, taken off the table, I think it is worth noting that in 2005 there's a precedent for this kind of withdrawing of proposed amendments to environmental law. In 2005, the Liberal minority government proposed a number of changes to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and they decided that they would, after discussion, they decided that they would remove those because of the kerfuffle that it caused. So I think that there's room to believe that this is a process that can be done again. In terms of provincial overlap and duplication, I think that what we're getting is a lot of rhetoric about red tape, a lot of rhetoric about what the provinces are able to do and what the federal government is able to do. I think it's really important to note that the federal government has constitutional jurisdiction over navigation, and the provinces do not. No provincial environmental assessment process is going to look at navigation. So by creating these exemption provisions, the federal government will allow the transport minister potentially to issue an order, take out certain works, take out certain kinds of waterways from the approval process, which thereby removes them from the environmental assessment process. Okay. Which therefore means that the provinces will be left to do the EAs, and they won't be looking at navigation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Amos. And we'll go now finally to the Department of Transport, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Dave Oswald-Eston. I'm the National Manager for Navigable Waters Protection Program for Canada. And joining me today is Madame Bridget Prue, who's our legal counsel with specialty on the Navigable Waters Protection Act and has been working on the amendments quite extensively with us over the course of the last several months. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate today. I'd like to start out by expressing our appreciation for your consideration of the amendments as proposed for the Navigable Waters Protection Act. The current amendments will allow a more flexible regulatory regime intended to support the diversity of the modern-day Canadian marine environment overall and in particular the development of infrastructure and natural resource projects. Streamlining of the federal government regulatory process for such projects, we understand, remains a priority for the government and for Transport Canada as we continue to move forward towards change and economic growth. As you're aware, the main objective and scope of the new Act, these amendments, is intended to meet the needs of proponents of works and those who use Canada's vast waterways in order to allow for a balanced approach to the shared use of those waterways. The current legislative and regulatory process fails to provide a review and approval process commensurate to the degree of potential interference to navigation. Small infrastructure projects with little impact on navigation and projects over waterways which cannot be reasonably used for the purpose of navigation are being caught in extensive review processes presently required within the legislation. As a result, current infrastructure project development timelines are being seriously affected and financial opportunities for funding are being passed. For example, the North Channel Bridge, which connects Akwesasne and the city of Cornwall, serves 2.2 million auto trips over 125,000 truck trips per year. The replacement of this bridge is long overdue. However, due to a gap within our legislation, a separate Act of Parliament would have to be passed to bring it to fruition, a process which will take much longer than simply providing for its review, as with all other bridges in Canada, under the proposed amended provisions of our legislation. Even the smallest but most common infrastructure projects, such as bridge redecking and guardrail replacement, projects which have no impact upon the navigational envelope underneath the bridge structure, currently generate a need for a navigational assessment. Simply put, we do not feel that such requirements are warranted nor to be reasonable. In order to make the Navigable Waters Protection Act relevant to today's operational and economic climate, the amendments would introduce a tiered approval process that would ensure a review and approval process more commensurate with the degree of potential interference that a work may have upon the navigation than what is provided for today. In saying this, we do recognize that there is concern among some interest groups that these amendments will adversely impact the current public right to navigate, and that major infrastructure and resource projects will no longer be required to complete environmental assessments under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. I'd like to take this opportunity to assure the committee that the Act will continue to protect the public right of navigation and that the environmental requirements for such projects will remain. The new provisions of the Act will define classes of navigable waters that would not reasonably be used for navigation. The intention, those waters, by the way, are very much, as Mr. McLaren has so kindly described, private lakes, for example, with single landowners all around, with land of a single landowner surrounding it. The intention of defining classes of minor waters is to better focus our efforts on truly navigable waters as opposed to farmers' drainage ditches or water courses too small, too shallow, too obstructed, or too steep to be reasonably used for the purpose of navigation. Similar to minor waterways, the concept of minor works will be introduced in the new legislation. Criteria is being developed for small structures such as private docks and boathouses that have little to no impact on navigation. This will allow the Department to reallocate the necessary resources required to manage the regulatory process for major projects involving infrastructure development, energy, mining, aquaculture, and forestry. Furthermore, the removal of term named works will allow for the review of any work commensurate with its potential impact on navigation and not on the basis of simply the type of work in question, allowing for better oversight and regulatory control over the installation of works on Canada's waterways. New provisions will provide also with a system of increased fines to act as a deterrent to noncompliance. In closing, a modernized Act will help us do a much more effective job of protecting the public interest in navigable waters, while at the same time expedite the infrastructure growth and redevelopment required today. Without them, we will continue to experience delays in approval of critical infrastructure projects. Our desired result is to stimulate the economy and remove the unnecessary regulatory burden while continuing to provide the due diligence with respect to the administration of this Act. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We'll go to questions from members. We'll start with Mr. Volpe for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to be here. Even though I'm not a regular member of this committee, I am one of the tourists and visitors from the Transport Committee. As you heard earlier on, the Transport Committee actually dealt with much of the background for this, and I want to thank all of the witnesses who have taken the opportunity to come forward and share some of their insights with those members of the Finance Committee who might not have been aware of some of them. I recall at least, two of them, because I have to give some deference as well to Mr. Osbaldiston, because I had trouble pronouncing his name last time as well. But and Ms. Tully from the Ontario Waterkeeper. I just want to ask a couple of questions very briefly, if you don't mind. I'm sure you will recall that the conversation went pretty well the same way. In the spring, we had 9 sessions, I believe, and you were one of the last ones to appear. I thought we gave you pretty exhaustive opportunity to share with us what you thought we needed to know for our report. In your reading of the amendments that are proposed under this format, whether you agree with the format or not, did you find things there that you didn't explain or we didn't ask in the spring?
I think that there were a lot of questions that day, and maybe it was my own failing in conveying the seriousness and the importance of navigation. But unfortunately, the proposed amendments that we see in Bill C-10 don't seem to take into consideration any of the concerns that I was trying to raise or did raise that day with the committee. The environmental assessment process is gone. The transparency in decision-making is gone. Centralizing control and decision-making in Ottawa has been added to the Act. The consultation, which we did talk about in great deal that day, never happened. We did talk about the possibility of reaching out to communities outside of the Ontario region who don't have the ability to come to Ottawa on a moment's notice, and that consultation didn't happen. I did have an opportunity to speak to some other people in the community that I know before coming tonight, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been any outreach to the First Nations communities, to Quebec or Alberta or the provinces, and so it concerns me that a year later, a lot of the concerns that we did raise that day with the committee still stand.
Well, let me take one of the issues, because I guess in this sense, I reflect a lot of other members of Parliament. I don't speak for them; they speak for their constituencies. But I reflect other members of Parliament, I think, in the desire to do the right thing. And so, there's a couple of points that you've raised and others have raised before you that I'd like to ask the Transport Canada officials, if I might. But it relates to what you said, because my understanding as we went through the entire process in the spring was that Transport Canada and navigable waters is but one of several elements in the whole approval process, and that, in fact, any changes to the Navigable Waters Act do not preclude, do not put aside, do not negate the obligations of Environment Canada assessments, provincial environmental agency assessments. In fact, the assessments by Fisheries and Oceans and by conservation authorities before any licenses for construction are let. Is that, in fact, a correct impression?
That's correct.
So I want to go to Mr. Amos, who said he spoke for 2.3 million paddlers in a series of organizations. Now, Mr. Amos, again, I think I reflect a lot of other members of Parliament. They can all speak for themselves. But I thought we were being pretty diligent in reaching out to as many organizations as we could, including First Nations communities, including provincial and municipal authorities, many of them that either sent briefs or sent witnesses. But I'm a little concerned that the conversation and the presentation that you made might go into direct conflict with what Mr. Osbaldiston just said, and that is that those other agencies are also there to protect interests, to protect businesses, to protect the rights of people. But it would appear to me that you say that this piece of legislation and the way that Parliament is handling it would make a, I'm sorry if this sounds a little harsh, would make a liar of what he just said.
Thank you for the question. I certainly would never suggest that we're, that any statements are making a liar of anyone here. I think that there are reasonable disagreements, however, on the impact and importance of the proposed changes. With respect to the variety of different assessment approval processes and environmental assessment processes that may or may not be triggered, I think I was pretty clear earlier, but I'll reiterate just so that we're all on the same page here. There is only one level of government, and there is only one process through which the effects on navigation are assessed, and that is pursuant to an approval under the Navigable Waters Protection Act, which triggers an environmental assessment. So navigation protection is something that is only ever considered through the NWPA process, and then pursuant to that through SIA. There are other assessment processes and other approvals. For instance, there are Fisheries Act approvals, which deal with fish habitat. There are approval processes that occur at the provincial level that may deal with waterways. However, those approval processes and those environmental assessments don't deal with navigation. So when I'm representing the paddling interests and navigation interests of the environmental community, the paddling community, the ecotourism community, these are interests that are specifically focused on the right of navigation.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll finish with
There'll be another time for another Liberal slot. So. I'm sorry, we're over time here. Thank you. Okay, well, he can share his time with you after he starts. Thank you, Mr. Volpe. Monsieur Carrière.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Previously, when I spoke up, I was told that oh, I'm sorry, I didn't welcome you. I should have welcomed you to our committee before I started. Previously, we stated that we were here as a Finance Committee to study the questions related to Navigable Waters Act. This was stated clearly. And I'd like to point out that there's not half of the members of the Finance Committee who are present here today. If you look around the door, there are people from the Transport Committee who replaced members of the Finance Committee. It's the same thing on the other side, and among the Liberals, half of them are not here. So it's members of the Committee of Finance who will have to accept this part on Navigable Waters Act. Not having heard you, they will have to vote and speak out on what they haven't heard. Nevertheless, I've had the opportunity of being a member of the Transport Committee in the previous session of Parliament, so I participated in talks that were proposed for changes to the Navigable Waters Act. It's in November that the Minister mentioned the possibility of refreshing the Act to make it more efficient, and we noted very quickly that it was a touchy subject. In fact, it was the first time that we were not studying a bill, but that the government asked the committee to propose something, which means that 4 months later, in June 2008, a report was produced by the Transport Committee, which gave possible solutions, the purpose being to allow the government to present a proper bill. Because in the report in question, all answers were not answered. It was up to the government to decide what they were proposing. And the objective at that time was to be able to study it later on and study the merit of this bill, to receive you once again, receive your comments, see what you approved and disapproved of in this bill. Listening to you, it's very obvious, and this is true also in the emails we've received in our offices. It's obvious that this bill touches many Canadian citizens. So I find it unfortunate that the Department of Transport is allowing this changes to the Navigable Waters Act to be included in the budget. It's tagged on to the budget. And we've been asked to work double time. We've been in a committee since 10 o'clock this morning to identify the shortcomings of the budget, because, as you know, there are other laws not related to the budget that are included in this bill. So through the participation of the Department of Transport, to try and convince us quickly that this bill is good, realizing that we won't have the time to present serious, well-thought-out amendments based on your comments, because we've been given only an hour and a half to listen to you. And I consider that this is a masquerade. We shouldn't be asked to study this change to this important bill. You know, we in the Bloc agreed with the principle of modifying this bill because there are things that have to be corrected. But you can be in agreement with the principle, so you ask for it to be studied to improve it, which is something that will not be possible in the study of the budget bill, because, as the Minister of Finance has mentioned, it's urgent to pass this economic bill. So we've got this budgetary pressure to pass bills that will not be considered in the different departments, such as the Department of Transport. Now, if any of you want to speak up, what do you believe of the way of acting of this government, trying to pass through important bills in an omnibus budgetary bill? Do any of you want to speak out on this? Mr. Amos? Thank you for your comments. I entirely agree with you. I find that when we are to decide important topics for Canada and for those who use these navigable waters, when these discussions are integrated in a budgetary process at a time of urgency, at a time of political emergency, I think it would be necessary to study this kind of amendment at another time, in another context. It's at another time that we should study changes to the protection of navigable waters. This should be done in front of a normal committee when we have time to study it properly. It should not be done within this budgetary context. I agree with you.
Mr. Matson?
Well, we think that, as we've suggested, if it was severed from the budget bill, it would benefit all Canadians and would be in the public interest that we took the appropriate amount of time to hear from Canadians from coast to coast and ensure that this bill achieved what Mr. Osbaldeston would like, but as well still protected the public interest in their right to have consent from the government before they take these rights away or that they be infringed.
Okay, thank you. Merci. We'll go now to Mr. Tweed, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll share my time with the member for Fort Mac. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and appreciate all the comments. I was the chair of the Transport Committee that proposed the changes to the Navigable Act. It was, I want to make it clear that there were no dissenting votes on the proposals and changes to the Act that were put forward. We did include a sunset clause because we felt that, like all legislation, there's challenges that have to be met in a future date. If we see the deficiencies, then we certainly have the ability to make those changes. I want to start just by commenting to Mr. McLaren. I've had the opportunity to serve provincially and municipal council, and I would have no qualms in saying I probably have 1,000 people like you in my riding with the very same situation, where a man-made ditch that serves no other purpose than to move water for 4 or 5 days in the spring is deemed a navigable water, and they can do nothing with it. And it hinders their ability to develop their own property, and it excludes them from any other process that everyone has to go through. And we heard, as a committee, we heard from municipal, we heard from provincial, we heard from organizations involved working with navigable waters, and I think it was unanimous in the reports that we received from them that these were the issues that concerned them the most and that had to be addressed by our committee, which Mr. Carrier was a very active member, and I think we all compromised a little bit to bring something forward that was amenable to most Canadians. I do want to talk to Mr. Osbaldeston. One of the conversations, and I think Mr. Volpe raised it, and I want to make it as clear as I possibly can. The comments we're hearing around the table, the comments we're hearing in emails from people that are concerned about this issue, do the rights of navigable water change with any of the amendments that we're proposing in this amendment, in these amendments?
No, they don't. Water that is navigated today will continue to fall under the purview of this Act, as will all water in Canada.
I'd also like to ask you, and I know it was discussed in our committee, how many projects approximately are backlogged because of this process? And I'm referring not to the major projects. I'm talking about the ones you discussed in your opening comments that are being held up because of this process that are actually have no impact on the Navigable Waters Act.
I can't give you top numbers off the top of my head. In general, though, we receive 2,500 applications a year, and we continue to have 2,500 remaining from the year before. So we never catch up.
Okay. Have you had any comment made to you or through anyone else that would suggest that by the changes that we're recommending would actually change the definition of navigable water?
No.
I think lastly, before I turn it over to Mr. Jean, I'm more interested because I think the committee had a real sincere feeling that we didn't want, and I think you reflected that, and I think it reflects in our minutes of our meetings. It was not the committee's intention to impede navigable waters. What it was to improve the Act so that people like Jack McLaren can get on with his life and do the things that he wants, and municipalities can do the same things without impacting the term or the definition of navigable water. Would that be a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
Thank you. Mr. G.
Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. And, I also sat on the committee. I was a parliamentary secretary. You know, when I hear fish habitat removed, the use of rivers for anglers gone, removing environmental assessment triggers, public notice is gone, scientific reviews terminated, interference to public right to navigation. It sounds like a Twilight Zone movie, and I wasn't there for this meeting that said this, and I didn't see any legislation. But the truth was, and is, that I went to every meeting. I heard from every witness, and I looked at the legislation thoroughly as a lawyer. for some 11 years litigating in the courts of Alberta. And that's another point. I'm from Alberta, and I represent 30% of Alberta, rural Alberta, places where people are impeded by this legislation on a constant basis. And when I ran for this job in 2004, this was the #1 concern. It wasn't BSE, it wasn't same-sex marriage, it was navigation and the ability to deal with things properly. So I wanted to let you know that. As well as I'm a registered trapper, an avid hunter. I taught canoeing. I've canoed most of the rivers in northern Alberta. And I taught canoeing for some period of time, and I love canoeing, and I love the outdoors, both winter and summer. And I would not ever put anything forward in any kind of legislation or proposal that would impede that in any way. But saying that, primarily for my constituents that vote me in at 67% every time I have an election, I want to ask a question to David just to clarify this. Will bridges, booms, dams, and causeways, which everyone knows here are primarily named, the named works, still be reviewed under the Navigable Waters Act after the proposed amendments are passed? Because I think that's the main concern, those major works, those named works.
Yes, they will. I know there's misinformation out there that because they're named and talking about removal of named works, the interpretation is that therefore these obvious obstacles to navigation would not continue to be reviewed under our legislation. But that's not the case. The removal of the quote named end of quote works, which is how the amendment is worded, is simply treating these things with any special accord, but rather to treat them as per any other obstacle that could potentially be placed in the water in the way of navigation. That is equitably and against the same standards, most specifically to the degree of impact upon navigation. So these items will definitely continue to be reviewed under the legislation and have to meet the same benchmarks as all other works placed in navigable water.
Thank you. You've got 20 seconds if you have a very short.
Mr. Chair, I'm just curious, and I would like to ask one more question to David. In essence, is there any environmental assessment trigger that's going to be removed that means that there will be no environmental assessment to a project?
I can't speak directly to the environmental assessment pieces because I'm not the environmental assessment agency and those that trigger what goes on the law list, but that will be reviewed. I can tell you that in our strategic environmental assessment that was done as part of our studies, the end result was that the result would be neutral. So nothing lost, nothing gained.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Mulcair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to also thank all the people who made presentations here today. First of all, I'd like to reassure Ms. Tooley, who doesn't have to apologize for not participating in broader consultations, because there weren't any broader consultations. So it certainly isn't her fault.
To whom I must start off by saying I have the greatest respect for the civil service, having spent more than 30 years in public service, half of it as a civil servant, including as chairman of a large regulatory agency, and half of it as an elected official. I can say that I know the difference between the two. I don't think, Mr. Obaldiston, you know the difference between the two, and I say that with respect. If you enjoy the game of politics, have the courage to put your face on the phone polls and get yourself elected. Tonight, you came into this committee and did something none of us have ever seen before. I have never, in over 30 years, seen a civil servant come before a committee and deliver such a purely partisan line. When you have the temerity to come before us and say that there's nothing in here that removes environmental protection, you're simply not saying the truth. It is not true that there's a tiered approval process in here. It's a complete change in the whole regulatory structure. All of the enabling provisions under this statute will be changed to give, as Ms. Tully correctly pointed out, pure discretion here in Ottawa. Now, I don't doubt your good intentions, but I am telling you that what you told this committee about the effect of this legislation is not true. In response to Mr. Jean, and I saw you pass a note to Mr. Jean before, and I think it's worth saying that, because that's part, yeah, sure, I'd like to see it, Mr. Jean. Colleague, confrère, I'm a lawyer too, and I can read a statute because I was involved in statutory drafting for a number of years. There is nothing further from the truth that this doesn't lessen environmental protection. An anecdote is not an argument, is not a case. In Mr. McLaren's very colorful example, he evoked the Drainage Act which, as you know, is an Ontario provincial statute, has nothing to do with what we're discussing here today. He evoked Fisheries and Oceans, which again has nothing to do with what we're talking about here today. He also alleged that there was an anecdote from the owner of a piece of equipment that it would be Fisheries and Oceans. We have no evidence of that whatsoever, yet you bought that holus bolus, and you reinforced it here before this committee, and that's wrong. Because this committee is trying to deal with a statute that would deal with something that has been properly protected in this country for over 100 years. And the Conservatives don't believe in environmental protection. That's why they want to remove it. You admitted that there will be changes to the triggers to environmental assessment. That was leaked a few weeks ago. We made it public. The plan is to reduce environmental assessments as a function of the value of the infrastructure that's being put into place, as if the protection of a precious wetland had something to do with the value of what you put on top of it. $10 million is the cutoff. So if you destroy a precious wetland for an infrastructure worth $9,500,000, somehow that becomes okay. It's not okay. That's why we have an Environmental Assessment Act. Your anecdote about your North Channel Bridge, I'd love to know the effect of the exclusion in the current Navigable Waters Protection Act. We keep saying the Navigable Waters Act. It's the Navigable Waters Protection Act. I'd love to know what the exclusion of the St. Lawrence Seaway, because it's obviously in the continuity of that, has on your anecdote about the North Channel Bridge. Perhaps you could provide some of that in writing. Coming here and pleading the backlog of cases as an excuse to go on and on about the more flexible process, purely partisan political argument, has nothing to do with the facts. Saying that you're here to streamline, purely partisan political argument, has nothing to do with the facts. Saying that financial opportunities are being lost, that's their line. They're elected. They put their pictures up on phone poles. They got elected to do a partisan political job. You didn't. Welcome to the debate, Mr. Osbaldiston. You want to play politics? Welcome to the debate. They're right. This is a scandal, removing 100 years of protection that Canadians have fought for. There are several signal pieces of legislation in this country that we can be proud of. This is one of them. They don't believe in it. They're removing it. People, like some of the ones who have spoken, are trying to give themselves a little bit of leeway in their own ridings in the north and trying to say, I did what I could and that's not what the statute did, and we brought the guy in to tell you that it wasn't the case. It is the case, Mr. Osbaldiston, because only a very naive person would believe that with the type of opening of the breaches and the enabling provisions here to come up with rules, regulations that will allow the creation of categories. That's not a tiered approval process. That's the ability to gut the essential elements of this statute. That's what this is about. That's why we're opposed to it, and that's why you should have been more forthcoming in your assessment before this committee. And I don't agree with the fact that an officer of the civil service, or un grand commis de l'État, as we would say in French, should be used to come in here and spin a purely partisan political line. I don't agree with it at all.
So now I would like to speak to Mr. Edwards and ask him if the listing of the amendments with respect to the enabling provisions does not run the risk of creating the possibility or of completely ruining the whole protecting provisions of the Act.
I'm not a lawyer. I apologize. I'm a paddler.
So am I.
I'm also a municipal politician, by the way. So I know about roads and bridges and culverts and beavers. I think we're deeply concerned about the amendments in the Act. We're deeply concerned about not being consulted. I'm sorry if I'm not answering your question directly.
That's good.
We do serve on the Standing Committee on Recreational Boating Safety, recreational boating, which deals with safety issues. Those are our primary concerns with regard to this legislation. I feel somewhat caught between two railway trains, so there's an opinion and suggestions there's no change over here, and yet everything I've read suggests there are substantial changes. I feel an enormous amount of lack of communication I mean, as I stated in the initial statement, we do wish to improve the legislation if at all possible, but we do need to be part of that process.
Well, I can only tell you that we will be fighting hard to have it decoupled from C10. And if it deserves another analysis.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead, Mr. Madsen.
Mr. Matson, you want to respond very briefly?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I've been an environmental lawyer for 20 years. I've worked 50, 60, 70 hearings. I've also done criminal, parole, prison law, immigration law. You know, there's always work that goes with getting approvals. And Mr. McLaren could probably phone me up and I could help him with a few pictures and a call to Transport Canada. We could probably resolve his problem along with the other thousands. And you don't need to overthrow the rights in Canada that government, not the politicians, but the government go to the public to get their consent when navigable rights get taken away or when they're infringed. That's what the Navigable Water Protection Act currently gives Canadians. Mr. Osbaldeston may be correct, and that he will still consider all the changes. But his consideration and that of the government of Canada is much different than that where you have to go to the public in order to get that consent. And that's the difference in the bill. And it turns a right into a discretionary decision.
Okay.
And that's where, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You have a point of order, Mr. Storseth?
Mr. Chair, and I, out of respect for my colleague, Mr. Mulclair, waited till the end of his tirade to bring this up. But I do believe under Marlo Montpetit that the House of Commons and parliamentarians are guided by a code of language, both in the House and in all adjutants of the parliamentary precinct. I believe we also extend that to our witnesses that we bring before us. I would think that, you know, we would have a common code of decency to not be calling, I do believe it's unparliamentary to call anybody that comes before us liars or accuse them of such things. So I do wish that this committee continue in a respectful manner. We can discuss the different ideological viewpoints, but this is a piece of legislation that's good for all the people in this country, and particularly my riding. Thank you.
On the same point of order, Mr. Mulcair.
Mr. Chairman, what I said was that the affirmations made by Mr. Osbaldeston were not true. And that is a question of fact, and I maintain it, and I will not withdraw it.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with Mr. Storseth that we want to be respectful and rule by decorum. But in fact, I did not hear Mr. Mulcair call Mr. Osbaldeston a liar. I mean, that was my hearing of the case. I would just encourage members. I know this is a very tense subject, and obviously there's strong feelings on both sides. But I would encourage them to continue to be respectful. We'll go to Mr. Volpe now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really didn't have a speech to make, but I wanted to pursue the line of questioning that I had before. So, if you'll forgive this sort of diversion back to a different approach, I was more interested in what Mr. Amos and Mr. Edwards had said, and again I go back to what I indicated earlier on, without any false humility. I think I'm reflective of the people who actually worked on the committee to try to get to the heart of the matter. And Ms. Tully, who came as one of the witnesses, I think would probably say that members around the table were really trying to come up with an appropriate report. Whether they succeeded is another matter. But there are two things that I've heard that cause me some concern. One, the language that suggests that parliamentarians are poised to take away rights of Canadians without having consulted with them. I'm concerned because it puts me in a position of someone who is ready to take away a right that's been enjoyed. I'm not in government, so I'll leave that responsibility to people on the other side. But, you know, we do represent Canadians, and we did go through a consultation process, and I'm not sure it's very helpful to think in terms of whether rights were being moved or removed. And so I want to ask the question again, maybe to Mr. Amos and Mr. Osbaldeston, because I asked this question once before when representatives from Fisheries and Ocean, Environment Canada, representatives from the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and I believe Newfoundland and Labrador, although I may be wrong on that one, and when representatives from the various municipalities and organizations of municipalities came forward. And that was this. If Transport Canada were to receive a report that suggested that it could make changes to the Navigable Waters Act consistent with what is now on the table, did that in any way derogate from the authority of Environment Canada, Fisheries and Oceans, and the other provinces to conduct their studies and come up with a negative response?
No, not in any way.
And if it does not, then, Mr. Amos, assuming that Mr. Osbaldiston is giving us a perception that reflects reality, if those subsequent assessments are negative, does that take away Canadians' right to enjoy the navigable waters in the way that they currently do?
Thanks for the question. I'll try to.
Well, is it yes or no?
I think it does take away. I think it does. It does both. It does incrementally take away rights of navigation, and I'll explain how.
Well, if those other 4 agencies do not agree with the proposal on the table and issue a license that alters the use of any property adjacent to those waters, how does that take away the right of a Canadian to enjoy something that was being enjoyed before those assessments went into place? And for the lawyers present around the table, if there is a due process that is undergone and that protects the interests of everybody along the way, why is that a taking away of rights?
Simply put, because the processes that will remain, that may, for instance, stop a given project, say a bridge, those processes, whether or not they have approved or not approved of that given infrastructure project, will not have considered navigation. So there may be environmental assessment processes or approval processes that do consider matters other than navigation, and they may approve a project not having considered navigation. And the reason I would suggest that it's, and this is the critical point to understand with the proposed amendments here, is that there are provisions for ministerial exemptions of works and waterways. If the transport minister, pursuant to these amendments, if the transport minister decides in his or her discretion, without any parliamentary oversight, without any prior consultation with other Canadians, if they decide that certain works, call it a small dam or a small culvert, or certain waterways, a stream 5 to 10 meters wide, if they decide that those works or waterways are to be exempted, there will be no approval process under the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and there will be no environmental assessment process. That means that navigation will not be considered.
Well, Mr. Amos, there were other lawyers that came before the committee in the spring that disagreed with that assessment, but that's okay. The reason is that we go through these. But
final last question.
Sure, and it goes to Mr. Madsen, actually. Because under this concept of rights being protected in stages, the Minister of Transport, as we were advised, doesn't make decisions for the Minister of the Environment and doesn't make decisions for the jurisdictions at the provincial level, which must also provide their consent before a layer of any right might be altered.
Okay.
And so, do you still hold that the Minister of Transport, by extension from your argument, that the Minister of Transport in Canada will dictate all rights that flow from the authority of the Minister of the Environment, or the various ministers of the Environment, Fisheries and Oceans?
Yeah, I wouldn't be here tonight, and I've come up on such short notice, if I didn't think that if the changes go ahead, that they would take away something so valuable in Canada. What Mr. Amos says is 100% right. If, when you change something with the Navigable Waters Protection Act, which really wasn't giving Canadians the right to navigate their waters, it was just putting into words, into statute, that which Canadians had in common law. So to take that away because government doesn't want to do the work any longer, or because they don't feel like their clients, they want them to move faster and they don't have the resources, that's wrong. This is something that, the decision should not be made in Ottawa or by the Minister of Transport. The tool is that every single time you go to block a river, put a dam or a causeway, you need to go to the people who are affected and seek their consent, and you need to do the research to provide it to those people first. To do otherwise would leave us with two-tier environmentalism. It wouldn't trigger environmental assessments under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act anymore. And ultimately, it would leave, protection of our waters to the people who are most powerful, have the most money, or the most influence. And those that may be one or two people in the middle of a 200 or 300 square kilometer empty space, they'll be lost. And those waters might be what really makes them feel Canadian and might make them what really feel being part of a special country. And that's why this act is so important. And that move from a right to a discretionary right is probably one of the most, serious and fundamental shifts in law that you can have.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Volpe. We'll go Monsieur Laforêt.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening to all the witnesses. I was really struck by the comments of Mr. Osbaldeston. He used a word which really shocks me. You spoke of modernizing to justify your support for this bill. And when I hear such a word, when I hear talk of modernism, that means something that is the opposite of what is archaic or traditional, because previously there was no consultation, no Department of the Environment, and no objections to projects from pressure groups, interest groups. There were no groups for ecotourism. There were no users of the environment like we have today, no users of navigable waters, no associations of canoe and kayak people. And now, in a modern country, we have people who use nature and the environment in other ways than the traditional ways. And these people are modern people. When you say that this bill, which will go against rights and give a discretionary power to one minister and could disregard any major environmental problems, I do believe that there is no place for the word modernism. I do not like you taking such a position in favor of the bill, which, as Mr. Carrier said earlier, he spoke about a travesty. Mr. Osbaldeston, do you often come to speak to the Finance Committee for a bill which comes from the Department of Transport? Have you done so often in the past?
Ça vous est jamais arrivé. Donc,
you never did that. You will therefore agree that we are witnessing a completely new situation. The Conservative government decided, with the support of the Liberals, to use as support, since they are in the minority, an agreed support to pass in a budget bills which have nothing to do with the budgetary process and which will be going against a process which had already been launched at the Department of Transport. I find this absolutely unacceptable. I wonder if you have any comments about this. You say this is the first time you do so, and I'm worried about that.
No, sir, I don't have any comments. I'm following the process that's put before me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no other comments.
Ms. Gallant, please.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. McLaren, how old were you when you dug that ditch by hand?
Probably 12 years old, 12 to 16.
And how old are you now?
84.
Okay, so that's almost the lifetime of a person, maybe a young person who would be an inspector coming by. For all purposes, that would look like a natural creek.
For someone, yes, it would look like a creek, but it was dug out to this mud hole, shall we say, so they could crop the land.
Okay, how far is your farm from Prescott? How many kilometers or miles?
From
your farm in Renfrew to Prescott, where the inspector came?
Roughly 120, 150 miles.
Okay. So what we've seen then, first of all, how many canoes or kayakers have used your ditch for that sport?
No, we haven't had any that I could see. They'd probably be very little.
Okay, so in Ontario, the definition of a navigable waterway in practice is extrapolated to include any collection of water. That's what we're seeing here. So as a consequence of this holdup, your production, your apple orchard has been held up. The production.
I have a deal with the federal and provincial governments for a takeout replant of an orchard, which will run into roughly $40,000, which has been put on hold, and now I don't qualify because I had to get these, I pretty much said clowns, gentlemen in to look at it. And I would presume they didn't really know what they were looking at, except a indent in the ground is called a creek. I think that's what this one man decided.
Okay.
He also told me that I did not own the water, which totally upset me because I had just drank 2 glasses of it.
Okay. So really, it's almost to you then like a make-work project for bureaucrats. And what these proposed changes will mean to you is that you'll have the freedom to be a responsible steward of your own private property without a parade of government officials.
That's exactly what I want to be able to do, is to run my own property and my orchard, hopefully, make a profit. I have it figured out here that the mileage added, the gentleman with the hi-ho would be coming past my place. I would ask him to come into my farm, which would have to come about 200 yards when he's going by on the way home some night, would take about an hour and a half to dig this out. So they have, by doing what they've done, and I still don't have permission, I have it figured out that from Pembroke Natural Resources and from Prescott, the total mileage that has been added to this would be 1,960 kilometers, where it would have been my telephone call and the gentleman coming in with his hi-ho and truck on his way home.
So about an hour and a half's worth of work has stretched into over a year, not to mention expense to you, but to the taxpayer in general in paying the mileage and the days of work for these inspectors.
Right. And these 2 people, they're on our taxpayers, these 2 gentlemen that come to our place. The taxpayers, all these people are paying them. Where it could have been done, that would have been dropped. I can handle it myself. Like, I've survived for 84 years, so I must be doing something right.
Okay.
And basically, I am sort of in an oddball spot here. I am not a lawyer. I am a farmer. I'm a 7th generation Canadian, but I have one thing. My grandfather that came to Canada laid stones on the Rideau Canal that was through Ottawa.
Thank you. And for the Department of Transport, whitewater rafting, the World Cup for freestyle kayaking, the internationally renowned birch bark canoe by the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan, they're all part and parcel of the Ottawa River right down here. Now, what is in this legislation that is going to stop my canoeists, my whitewater rafting industry, and my kayakers from enjoying that river, and my fishermen?
Okay.
We have
question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you to all the witnesses who came before and made their presentations and answered our questions. We appreciate your time here this evening. Members, we will suspend for 1 or 2 minutes and bring the next set of witnesses forward. Thank you. Presenting as 5 groups, though. We have Fédération de Travailleurs et Travailleuses de Québec. We have the Association of Justice Council. We have federally regulated employers, transportation and communication. And we have 2 groups which I understand are presenting as one, Option Consommateur and the Public Interest Advocacy Center. And we have finally the Canadian Association of Professional Employees. So if I can ask each organization to do a 5-minute opening statement in that order, and then we will go to questions from members. So we'll start with, where's the Fédération de Travailleurs et Travailleuses? Are they here? No? Okay, let's start with the Association of Justice Council.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, l'Association des juristes de justice avec
Association of Justice Council, AJC, is very pleased to have this opportunity to submit its views concerning the proposed expenditure bill, Bill C-10.
Concerns with this legislation, and then I will be pleased to answer your questions. Our association represents over 2,500 lawyers across the country. Those who are employed by the federal government, they are in the Department of Justice, they are in the prosecution, Public Prosecution Service Canada, and they also work in federal agencies. They perform critical tasks in many areas, including prosecution, constitutional law, consumer and regulatory protection, national security, immigration, and commercial law. In 2005, the Government of Canada extended the right to collectively bargain to the federal government lawyers. And in 2006, we began to negotiate our first collective agreement with Treasury Board. 3 years later, these negotiations have not led to a successful conclusion. As a result, federal lawyers have not had a salary increase since April 1st, 2005, and our salaries have been substantially behind those of our provincial counterparts. Our comparative salaries levels now rank 7 in the country when they used to be either first or second. We're now behind those of Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. To provide just one example of the disparity, federal government lawyers today earn between 40 and 60% less than their Ontario provincial counterparts. This salary gap is even more pronounced in comparison with our private sector counterparts, whom we regularly appear in court and in representing the interests of the Government of Canada. L'impossibilité de pouvoir corriger
the impossibility of correcting this wage disparity raises 3 issues which are important for the administration of justice here in Canada, all of which are engendered by Bill C-10 with respect to wage controls and government expenditures. First of all, the federal government is having an increasingly difficult time retaining its lawyers. These people are leaving their jobs to take up jobs elsewhere, either to retire. As soon as they can retire, they do so. Or they go and work for a provincial government. Or they simply return or go into private practice. It is very simple for them to cross the street and work for a provincial government and make thousands of dollars more in income per year doing exactly the same type of work that they're doing for the federal government.
Salaries is severely hampering the ability of the federal government to recruit top-notch legal talent to replace those who are leaving. In some locations and fields of expertise, the lack of qualified lawyers has reached critical levels. For example, in the city of Calgary, which includes the Prime Minister's own riding, the Public Prosecution Service of Canada has lost more than half of its lawyers, prosecutors, and has not been able to replace them. It's the same thing in British Columbia, in Ontario, and in the other provinces. Third, as a result of the long-standing salary disparity facing federal government lawyers, morale is at an all-time low. 1 minute. All these challenges have been documented publicly in the recent annual reports of Public Prosecution Service, Department of Justice, and if Bill C-10 passes in its current form, none of these challenges will be addressed. In addition, federal lawyers will not only be singled out as the only group deprived of the process for negotiating their first collective agreement, but also as the only group not to have a negotiated or arbitrated salary increase for 2006-2007 year. Must contrast treatment of the AGC with that of another employment group in a similar situation. I'm talking here about the border guards who were granted a salary increase of 19.5% 3 days before. Finally, we respectfully urge the members of this committee to seriously consider the constitutionality of Bill C-10, especially in its specific and disproportionate impact on lawyers. Thank you.
I think we'll go back, Monsieur La Liberté. We'll go back to you then and have your presentation. 5 minutes.
Okay, merci. Thank you for the opportunity given to us to finally give our opinion about the budgetary process in Canada. It would have been nice to have done so beforehand, but it's always a good thing to be able to talk. In our opinion, the budget, which was brought down, includes very nice measures, but it's not enough. In our opinion, there should have been emphasis, first of all, on improving the employment insurance program, because we are going through a major crisis and because this program has major macroeconomic consequences. And since its reform about 15 years ago, it was never tested by a true recession. This was, therefore, for us a key issue in a recovery program. Of course, it was improved slightly by extending the benefit period, but there are other things which, in our opinion, were as important, and nothing was done to improve them. For us, what we find even more disappointing is that a lot of money was spent on other items, even though for us the employment insurance program was a major point in any recovery plan. You know, unemployment in a typical recession starts with the lowering of certain indicators, such as market indicators. There will be a recovery which starts on the markets, and it takes at least 2 years for the unemployment rate to go back to its normal level. If you take it for granted that the current recession might be even more serious than expected, the unemployment problem might be there for a long time. The other thing that I wanted to say is that there is certainly an effort made as far as training is concerned, but we had asked for a special program for older workers who will not be able to find another job, especially in a difficult economic period. There should have been a program to allow them to have a bridge from their previous job to retirement. This had been considered under the Liberal government. It would have been nice to reinstore this program since it's not that costly considering everything. As for the infrastructure expenditures, the amounts are certainly interesting. What we think is missing here, however, is a prescription for purchases in Canada. Americans use such provisions quite legally under the WTO and the free FTA. In Canada, about $100 billion will be spent on infrastructure in the coming years, and nowhere do we find any provisions talking about Canadian contents and about favoring Canadian businesses, which seems to us ridiculous, even though we have kept the provisions which deal with public-private partnerships. I do not have any time to talk about wages, wage parity. Simply, I will say that the budget is perhaps not an appropriate instrument to talk about the problems of salary equity, pay equity. We would like we would really like the government to come back on this decision and to introduce an independent bill about this.
Thank you very much. I am going to ask David Olson, who is Assistant General Counsel for Canada Post, to present our position. He is also a member of FETCO and has been involved in the employment equity matters for many years. So, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I should state that although I am counsel to one of the members of FETCO, I'm here as a representative of FETCO and not on behalf of Canada Post. Thank you. FETCO, what does it stand for? Federally Regulated Employers in Transportation and Communication. We are an organization of most of the major employers and employer groups in transportation and communication under federal jurisdiction. A brief will be submitted. At Appendix A to that brief will be listed all of the members of the organization: Canada Post, CBC, the railways, the ports, the airlines, and so on. FETCO members employ approximately 586,000 workers, 212,000 of which are unionized. We represent approximately two-thirds of the unionized workforce under federal jurisdiction. We are pleased to be invited here today to give our preliminary views on the proposed Public Sector Equitable Compensation Act. Our members have extensive experience with the current Section 11 of the present Canadian Human Rights Act. A number of us have been deeply involved in equal pay for work of equal value issues, assessments, and litigation over decades. It is without a doubt a deeply important and complex issue. However, there are certain flaws in the current Section 11 of the Canadian Human Rights Act that have generally been unhelpful to parties in resolving equal pay disputes. So we'd like to comment on that. The proposed Public Sector Equitable Compensation Act, while it does not apply to our members in the federally regulated private sector, contains important new principles and sound operative provisions that we believe will improve the ability of employers and unions in the federal public sector to assess and implement equal pay or equitable compensation for men and women in a manner that is pragmatic and fair. This legislation makes sense to our members because, one, it integrates equitable compensation, equal pay for work of equal value, into the collective bargaining process. Two, it requires that both employers and unions share responsibility for equitable compensation or pay equity, not the employer alone. And more importantly, for those of us who've been involved in protracted litigation under Section 11 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, it provides a more efficient, effective, and equitable problem-solving and dispute resolution procedure. The heart of the issue for FETCO has always been the fact that equal pay for work of equal value must be integrated into the collective bargaining process. Like equal pay for work of equal value, freedom of association for employees is accorded the status of being a fundamental human rights. And both are considered sacrosanct in our society. But that does not mean, in our view, that they cannot be addressed together. If anything, they must be addressed together in order for both to be balanced and achieved. The current Section of 11 of the Canadian Human Rights Act articulates only the general principle that men and women who are performing work of equal value must receive equal pay. Other than articulating the general principle, it has been left to the courts and tribunals. 1 minute, okay. It's okay. Okay. In our view, this vagary of Section 11 has been routinely and strategically leveraged by trade unions as a means by which to effectively reopen negotiated collective agreements, a second kick, as it were, which flies in the face of the fundamental sanctity of collective bargaining. This is fair in a non-unionized environment where the employer alone is responsible for setting the wage package and terms and conditions of employment. But in the unionized sector, it is both the employer and the trade union that together are responsible for making a bilateral decision about terms and conditions of employment. And I dare say, in my experience anyway, it is largely the trade union that makes decisions about how that wage package is to be allocated and distributed. And so it's the collective bargaining parties that must also be responsible for implementing pay equity. We elaborate more fully in our brief on these issues and the mischief of the current legislation. FETCO did commission a comprehensive study on the issue when we appeared before the Bilson Task Force. And Professor Paul Weiler, a noted Canadian academic, labor lawyer, and jurist, prepared a paper, and it has also been provided to you. In sum, if I just could,
sorry, Mr. Olson. We'll
thank you so much
for questions. Sorry about that. My understanding is the next two groups will be presenting together. Is that correct? Or yes, okay. Ms. Bose.
Bonsoir. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you to the members of the Standing Committee, to the clerk and his staff for their invitation to appear before the committee this evening to talk about Part 12 of Bill C-10 about the amendments concerning competition. I am responsible for the Ottawa office of Option Consommateur. I am accompanied by Mr. Michael Janigan, Executive Director and General Counsel of the Public Interest Advocacy Center. For over 30 years, our two organizations have represented the interests of consumers in the businesses which are regulated federally. Mr. Janigan has already spoken before committees about Bill C-19, which was never passed by the previous government, by the previous parliament.
Are quite comprehensive. They have certainly been the subject of considerable past discussion among stakeholders, and in our opinion represent a fairly balanced approach to the necessary refinements to the Act. Take, for example, the issue of the amendments which complete the reform of misleading advertising or deceptive marketing that has been the consensus for over 2 decades. These amendments help the competition authorities address this abuse in an economic and administrative fashion. In the view of Option Consommateur, this package of amendments places appropriate emphasis on the importance of deterring anti-competitive conduct, particularly in the current difficult economic and financial environment that all Canadians are experiencing. I'm asking Michael Janigan to give some additional comments on the importance of these amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is essential that the committee understand that these amendments are designed to make markets work better and to protect the legitimate interests of consumers and suppliers in open markets. The practices that are being deterred involve conduct that subverts the operation of a competitive market and prevents the existence of an informed market of consumers, as well as the ability of suppliers to challenge dominant players with new products and services. When some of these changes were brought forward in Bill C-19 in 2005, there were some vociferous protests from some of the larger business players concerning the potential burdens that could be imposed upon them. If a protest occurs again, it's important that these submissions are adjudicated on their merits, not on the basis that they represent the views of all non-governmental stakeholders. For example, you won't be hearing from the independent business person who has used the family assets to finance a new business, only to see it crushed by the actions of suppliers of the new business instigated by a market incumbent. You may read about a scam luring shoppers to purchase a wonder product that is misrepresented and misdescribed, but the pensioner who has cut back on necessities because she fell for the scam won't be here to tell you that, as some have suggested, what happened to her is an acceptable risk that allows for more creative advertising to take place. And you won't hear from parties who complain about increases to maximum penalties that the existence of dollar amounts sufficiently robust to deter the largest of businesses from breaching the Act will probably prevent more bureau files from being opened because of business self-policing to avoid such sanctions. But it is the highest importance that you understand that deterring anti-competitive conduct, as proposed here, is not the heavy hand of government in operation. Instead, it is supportive of open markets and less regulation. The fact is, a lot of money can be made by misleading the public or unfairly stacking the deck against competitors. Unless you have the tools at hand, as this Act promises, to prevent such conduct from being rewarded, you are allowing 3 unfortunate things to happen. You are preventing informed choice and possible innovation. You are enabling inefficiency in the delivery of that product and service, and you are ensuring that incumbents have little incentive to become more productive. As a final matter, Dr. Bose will address a small amendment of concern to Quebec consumer organizations.
In the future, it's probable that these new procedures in the bill will be applied instead of class action suits in provincial courts. We propose that the articles of C-19 be included before the present article 7419, and that afterwards Article 7919 be put number 10. That would mean that the right to class action suits of Quebec consumers will not be affected, and the same right will be available to all consumers in Canada. We thank you, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Final group, the Canadian Association of Professional Employees.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We represent 12,000 Canadian professional employees. Some are well known, such as the analysts at the library, the translators, the interpreters who work for the House, but mostly economists who advise you, the policy analysts who are also there to advise you, are all represented by CAPE. Let me tell you that about 10 years ago, Treasury Board, Her Majesty, decided to reduce the number of groups with which the state should bargain. From 65 to 70 professional groups, it was proposed to reduce that number to 25 or 30, from 65 or 70. The bargaining agents, such as CAPE, accepted this exercise and had to regroup themselves. Economists and other professionals represented by CAPE ended up before a fait accompli that a new category called the EC group would be created. Nobody knew what this meant, the EC group, but it brought together economists, sociologists, and others. To facilitate the work, eventually we proposed a new classification, because the classification standard of the government at that time was not applicable to this group for different reasons. It was proposed that a new classification system be created. And to facilitate this work, certain salary scales were merged together, were joined together, so that there'd be only one different pay scale with different levels for these different people. The last stage of this effort was to be, and the parties around the table agreed on this, the last stage of this process was to be the negotiation of new salary scales, which was to be done in 2005 or 2006. Unfortunately, the EC classification scale was not sufficiently advanced at that time for the new pay scales to be negotiated, and so we signed a collective agreement of only 1 year, with the formal promise that the next bargaining round pay scale would be negotiated. So we're now in fall 2008, where the government sends their final offer, an offer that our members have just accepted without problem, thinking that this salary conversion would come into effect eventually. Unfortunately, when we saw Bill C-10, especially Part 10 of the bill, we see that there's only one exception. My colleague mentioned it previously. The Border Guard Association, they obtained the salary conversion, while our members, who unfortunately do not protect our borders, but who do serve the Canadian state, will be forgotten once again. Now, a change in classification is something that happens once in your career. Our members have been waiting for this change for 15 to 20 years, and the next change will probably occur in 20 or 30 years from now. So people profit from this once in their career. It's their last opportunity. So if the bill makes an exception of the border guards, we propose as a recommendation to allow healthy bargaining, to add little article of 5 lines, which would be exactly the same as the one for border guards, and which would allow the conversion of the salary for our group. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Mr. McKay, please.
Chair, thank you, witnesses. A number of you are opening up a window on some rather unhappy employer-employee relationships, which the government appears to have chosen a route that, with a sledgehammer, to have eliminated a number of problems right up front. Mind you, I do have some problems with economists being represented here. They got it so wrong in the past year that maybe they should be punished for an entire lifetime of career. But let me start with another favorite group, named the lawyers. You have a very legitimate dispute with the government of Canada, and I take completely your point that your pay relationships are certainly much less than your provincial cousins, and much less than your than private sector counterparts. Although I'm not sure it's a good time to go into private practice of law in the current economic circumstances. So the question here really is, aside from a complete exemption from Bill C-10, what is the other alternative in terms of solving your dispute? I understand, for the last 3 years you've been negotiating, but it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. So what are the alternatives here?
Well, we have the right to negotiate, and that right is protected by the Charter. So anything else than negotiations would be less than what the Charter of Right gives us. So what we're looking for is exactly that, an exemption, just like the border agents got an exemption also for the deal they had negotiated 3 days before the budget, the economic update was tabled.
Did they get
As
an
a matter of
exemption, or
fact,
did they just get lucky?
I'm sorry?
Did they get an exemption, or did they just get lucky?
No, I doubt it. They got lucky because it's clear in the Act, and it's clear in the Act that the AJC and our members are being targeted. We are the only one with the year 2006-2007 on the radar screen. No one else is like that in the federal government. So why target the AJC? Its 2,500 members are specifically targeted because of that disposition. And beside being targeted, the year 2006-2007 was not in the economic update filed back in 2008. It was not even in the budget that was filed in January. But out of a sudden, it appears in Bill C-10. So we can ask questions about that, about the AJC and our members being targeted unfairly by that legislation.
Okay, thank you. To Ms. Boyce and Mr. Janigan, we had representations earlier in the day from Mr. Beauchamp, Canadian Real Estate Association, and his argument was that removing the undue lessening of competition requirement would require the resulting provisions be overly broad. Without the qualification of undue, a very wide range of agreements would fall within the scope of the offense. His point being that that he liked the legislation the way it currently is, that it's almost impossible to prove undue restriction in competition. Leave it as it is. If you change it, then you'll catch a whole bunch of unintended consequences. What's your response to Mr. Beauchamp's position?
Well, I think first of all, the Bureau has to be commended for listening to effectively the consensus associated with this, that in fact what we really need is a division of matters into per se offenses that are prosecutable by criminal law and basically represent clear attempts to try to frustrate the Competition Act. And the other, the civil side of things, which look to the anti-competitive effect of the actions and treat it as a civil matter, treat it as an economic matter, and attempt to allocate it in accordance with general economic principles. Now, I think the consensus previous to this has been that the provisions of the Act were almost unenforceable because of the presence of the undue section. And I think while it might be fair that some industry players may have preferred the old section of the Act primarily because it was toothless, there are undoubtedly players within the business community, people that are prepared to invest, people are prepared to set up businesses, people are prepared to do things that will be very pleased by this kind of action, but because it will prevent incumbents from acting in a way which frustrates their attempts to deal with it.
He seems to be concerned about real estate agents and brokers in a given region setting fees and schedules and commissions among themselves, which,
1 minute,
on the face of it, seems to be restrictive of trade. Do you think that the legislation as drafted that his concern is a legitimate concern?
No, I don't. I think there are a number of different also exemptions that are in the Act, particularly related to efficiency, for example. Probably more generous than I would have drafted, that would allow the Competition Tribunal, for example, to look carefully at what the intent of any agreement is, whether or not it is beneficial across the board, and whether or not it just brings efficiency into the process. And if it is anti-competitive, effect, it will be struck down. And that may be troublesome for that industry, but over the whole course of economic life, it's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. McKay. Monsieur Laforêt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to say good evening to all the witnesses tonight. I have a specific question for Mr. Laliberté. Now, you represent members who are mainly in Quebec, workers in Quebec. Now, in the budget, now you didn't refer to this, but there are measures in there to provide assistance to the auto sector in Ontario for a value of $2.7 billion that include loan guarantees to the auto industry. However, we also know that in Quebec, the auto industry is practically non-existent. But there is an industry which is experiencing a lot of trouble, and that's the forestry industry, and that's been the case since 2005. In fact, I think you have many, many members who work in the forestry processing industry. What I'm getting at is that we're talking about $70 million only for that sector, all across Canada, for the forestry sector. And the government, the Conservative government, is saying that it is impossible because of the softwood lumber agreement to provide loan guarantees, which is not true. It's not true because the Quebec government did that through Investment Quebec in order to support industries. And when we know the kind of assistance being given to the auto industry, do you not think that it's a bit unfair, not to say very unfair, towards the workers that you represent? The huge difference between the amount of assistance being provided to both industries. Well, you're right to talk about the lack of diligence. Now, the forestry crisis is not one that only affects Quebec. It affects all of Canada. And as you said, It's for several years now, there have been a lot of issues. Now, particularly in Quebec, there was a problem with equipment, old equipment, and, as you say, loan guarantees could have provided some very valuable assistance to the industry. So you're right. That is one of the things that we have asked for in order to protect jobs. We also asked that where there is no choice, the plant has to close down. We asked that there be assistance, transition assistance for workers. And that brings us back to the program for older workers. But what is worrisome is that we don't have the feeling there's any game plan there. Even for the auto industry, that's sort of the impression we have, that everything is kind of vague. And we also see this with respect to property. Now, in the forestry industries, there are practically no companies that are Canadian-owned, and it's the same thing in other sectors as well, the mining industry and so forth. Now, as you see, the Toronto Stock Exchange has bought the Montreal Stock Exchange, and the fact is that Canadian companies are leaving. So there's a real problem there. And I'd say that philosophically there's been some negligence there that predates the current government. And I think we have to ask ourselves some serious questions. Do we want a forestry industry, for example, that produces value-added products? What kind of equipment is needed? What kind of strategy is needed? For example, and this is another important thing, do we want a manufacturing, can the manufacturing sector survive with a dollar at parity, at par? Because we believe that this is a problem that could affect many other industries. So this is the kind of issue that nobody ever talks about. And if the government doesn't create any forums where those things can be discussed, who's going to do it? Now, I agree with you that if there had been more significant, extensive consultations, it would have been a very positive thing for you and others, and we could have talked about those kinds of issues. But I have a question for Mr. Poirier now. I was listening to you earlier, but when you say that there's an opportunity now that will only come again in 20 years, I didn't really understand what you were getting at. Well, historically, when there's a reclassification or a conversion of classification in the public service, people don't feel the need to redo that exercise 5 years later. The value of the work is reassessed, the position is reassessed, the tasks are reassessed based on an analysis grid that has to be reassessed. So you redo the grid, and then after that, you develop those job descriptions. But what you're saying is that it would be ready to be applied? Well, I'd say that for 7 years now we've been working on this. We're in the last stage, and the last stage was negotiation. And the government is using the pretext that that doesn't work, when in fact it works very well. And we have the example of our analysts here at the Library of Parliament. We've just signed an agreement in principle that was negotiated. It wasn't imposed. It was negotiated between the parties, but with a different employer, the Library of Parliament. So we're not negotiating with the Treasury Board. It's a different employer. But it worked very well in that case. Now, of course, based on the economic context, our members may have to I have to talk about this in the future because the agreement has not yet been ratified. People will be voting on it. But we have recommended that they accept the agreement, and it will be at rates that will be quite low. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Laforêt.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our guests here tonight for coming at this hour on a Monday, and I really appreciate it. I just have a few questions. in my 7 minutes, and I just want to be, we've heard a lot of delegations today, so I want to be perfectly clear. And I'm going to ask Mr. Olson to answer, if you don't mind. You're here representing FETCO, right? Based on your presentation, I know we didn't hear the conclusion, but you're in favor, basically, of the changes that we're proposing in this legislation. Is that not?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Now, we had a presentation earlier from the Professional Institute of Public Service of Canada, and Mr. Grenville Wood, General Counsel. And in his conclusions, now he has a different view. He'd like to see it separated out. There's no doubt about that. He'd like to see it as separate legislation. But he also says here that, and while meeting the overall objective of having pay equity, the subject of negotiations between the employer and the various public service unions. When I read that, to me that means that he also agrees that it should be part of the employer union agreement package in his conclusions here. And I'll read it again just so you hear it. While meeting the overall objective of having pay equity, the subject of negotiations between the employer and the various public service unions. Based on that, I take that he agrees that should be an agreement. I know you don't have it in front of you, but
I don't know the context, but and I'm just surmising that he may advocate a separate piece of legislation, but agrees with the principle that equal pay for work of equal value issues should be addressed at the bargaining table.
Okay. And have you been advocating for this position for a while, or is this something new for your organization?
FETCO appeared before the Bilson Task Force looking into this issue in 2002, and certainly it was the position of FETCO at that time, based on the work of Professor Weiler, that for the unionized workplace, that the two processes should be integrated. That is, that equal pay for work of equal value should be integrated with the collective bargaining process.
I appreciate that clarification. Now, for our delegations from the joint presentation from representing consumer advocacy groups, I guess you would say, another part of the budget, which I don't think you mentioned, and maybe I missed it, was we're doing some work on well, with credit cards, basically, and in terms of fairness and transparency. Did you have any comment on what we're trying to accomplish in the area of credit card control that is outlined in this economic action plan?
I'm afraid we haven't studied the issue empirically. Certainly our reaction to the fact that the government is moving in this direction is a positive one, and we hope to be able to provide something more substantive in the future to assist the government in their plans to try to control the industry.
I appreciate that. I know that was kind of out of the blue. On the topic that you were actually here for tonight, advocating for the changes that are outlined in the action plan, the changes can you tell me, is this something also I'm interested to know how long your two organizations have been working on these issues, and now you're finally seeing some action taken on that? Is that something that's just relatively new, or have you been working on it for a number of years?
It's been a lengthy process for both organizations. I can recall back in 1992, one of the first things that I did when I became executive director was to review a project that involved decriminalization of misleading advertising and the possible steps that could be taken to try to enforce things civilly. So effectively, we're seeing sort of the end of that process 15 years down the line.
Okay. Dr. Voss, you have
anything? Option Consommateur has worked on this for 8 years.
8 years. Okay. So,
and also, I might add, Mr. Wallace, that we are having a conference next month on consumer indebtedness.
Oh, okay. And will that be in Ottawa?
No, it will be in Montreal, and we shall be very happy to invite you to come.
Well, I'm one of those indebted consumers. How much time do I have?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, great. And then I don't mean to be mean about this, but you know, I'm from Burlington, and a number of companies are closing, and we've had some unemployment. Can either the lawyer organization or the professional organization tell me in recent times how many of your members have been laid off by the federal government?
I don't think we can make any comparison between the private sector and the federal sector. That's for sure. But you have to consider also that these people have a career that runs on 30 years or 35 years in some for some people, and they do expect from their employer to be just.
Right. You're
from one group to the other.
Yeah, I agree. You expect fairness, but part of the advantage, in a sense, of being a public servant, which you won't get another guy saying anything other than good things about public servants. I come from the municipal world. They work hard. They do all the work. The tremendous amount of work's done by public servants here. But part of the advantage of public servants is that there is job security that may not exist in other marketplaces. Would you at least agree with that?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay, if I may. No, there has been no layoff. As a matter of fact, our problem is your problem, or the problem of the government that will follow, because you won't have to lay off anyone because there will be no one enough left to do the job. That's the problem. It's the opposite of layoff problem. We're losing people, and you can't replace them.
Right.
See, that's
cannot,
your problem and the problem of the government that will follow.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wallace. We'll go to Mr. Mulcair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must admit that there are always surprises when Mr. Wallace talks, but tonight is something really special with this last intervention. But I must suggest that he must be tired as he's forgetting what was said this morning. For him to take the appearance of Mr. Englewood as he has interpreted it, it's ridiculous.
Not only unconstitutional, but it also creates an unworkable, self-defeating morass from which the concept of pay equity will not only not prosper and advance, but it will wither and die. This cannot or ought not to be the intent of Parliament. And then he was saying that he had the conclusion. Let's go to the conclusion. In conclusion, the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada believes that the laws proposed represent a gross intrusion into and interference with the constitutional rights of our members generally and with our female members in particular with respect to the pay equity law. That's what Mr. Grenville Wood said. That is the substance of what he said. That is the pith of what he said. Now, for Mr. Wallace to have taken that, it's sort of in line with his other interventions saying, you guys can't get fired. Mais n'est-il pas exact, Monsieur Jeté, que comme vous l'avez mentionné, que les employés...
Mr. Jeté, as you said, it's a fact that lawyers at the federal government are being paid less than their provincial counterparts. Yes, that's exactly the problem. Our own lawyers can just have to cross the street to be paid thousands of dollars more than their federal counterparts. I saw that myself. I left my job at the federal level, and then you had a very nice career at in the private sector. Yes, there is one place where it was very hard to keep employees because it was in Gatineau, because the federal government at the time was paying more. We were unable to keep our employees at that time. And now the Conservatives are saying that you are really spoiled because you can't be fired. Mr. Poirier, there is something very nice. Mr. McKay of the Liberal Party, this great party which once was the government, said earlier that he was ready to vote for amendments to help your union, and the same thing for you, Mr. Jeté. What I'm therefore suggesting is the same that Madame Vos and Mr. Jensen said earlier. Could you please tell us exactly what sections you would like to see amended? Since now I know that Mr. McKay and Mr. McCallum will be voting with us to pass these amendments.
Legitimate dispute. Je peux pas croire que quelqu'un qui se dit libéral, prêt à se battre.
I can't believe that people who call themselves liberal pourrait ne pas voter en faveur des amendements, would not be voting for the amendments you will be submitting to us. I therefore offer you to bring these amendments tomorrow morning to us, and then with the support of the Bloc and the Liberals, led by Captain Flush here, we'll be able to settle this issue very, very quickly, Mr. Chairman. The provisions we are suggesting are in our brief, and I have a caution to make here. This would open the door to negotiations, and we saw that negotiation can work. It will be a balanced approach, a balanced process in view of the economic situation, but at least it would be negotiated. And what we're suggesting is also in our brief. Also, there is a mechanism for negotiation called the Labor Relations Board, which is there to regulate what happens and ensure that salary negotiations are assessed according to the government's capacity to pay. Arbitration is the end of negotiation. We could therefore do what we want and guarantee that our rights will be completely and fairly protected if we could go to arbitration. Ms. Bose, could I ask you about Section 70-something? Could you send that to us in writing for tomorrow? Yes, you will receive it tomorrow morning. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mulcair.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Merci aux témoins pour avoir.
Thank you to the witnesses for having sent their briefs to committee. I have one question for Mr. Poirier. You spoke about pay conversion and also classification. Could you give us an example of what you were saying, a monetary example? Because there are many sectors in your association, economists, translators, interpreters. I'm sure that everyone doesn't have the same salary. There are people from about every wage scale. Economists at the start of their career do not earn the same salary as those who are at the top of the wage scale who can earn over $100,000, the various parties sit down and examine the value of work. The employer, represented by the Treasury Board, and the negotiating agent. They sit down and look at an analysis of the value of work and find out if the pay scale is proportional to the value of this work. In certain cases, it can go down. In other cases, it can remain at the same level when there is a conversion to be made. And that is done for 10,000s of mostly economists and sociologists. How many other categories are there? There are also the translating group, which includes translators, terminologists, interpreters, and the analysts for the Library of Parliament, who are about 90. Therefore, there is a scale that is established. Yes, there are 8 levels in the collective agreement, but only 7 are really used. And at each scale, there is a salary bracket. And in percentage, what does that mean? That can recommend that could represent what? It could be neutral, as in no increase. This is always negotiated. Thank you, Mr. Poirier. Mr. McCallum.
For the purpose of to clarify with Mr. Mulcair, I'll remind him what I've said about 3 times today. That much as there are many things in this budget we do not like, the overriding priority is to deal with the economic crisis and to get the money out the door. I think I've said that frequently. But my question to Madame Bowes, Mr. Janigan, you obviously do like the content of the competition changes. Many do not. But for me, it's at least as much a question of process. That we have a hugely complex set of changes to the Competition Act rammed through in this Budget Act in such a way that there's no time for debate. I suspect on our side there is much we would like in it, but it is so complex. It is change of a nature that only occurs approximately every 20 years. There may be some elements in there which will have unintended consequences. So I cannot understand why you could approve of the process and why you would not prefer to see this as a standalone bill to have the scrutiny that it deserves. Or am I wrong on that point?
Yes, Mr. McCallum, there are some comprehensive changes to some of particularly the powers that are enjoyed by the Competition Commissioner and the Competition Tribunal. Most of these have been discussed and discussed and discussed over the years, particularly in relation to things like administrative monetary penalties, expanding the ability of the Competition Commissioner to seek administrative remedies. We look upon it rather as it's not something in terms of effectively changing the substance of the Act, but rather changing the toolkit and the ability of the Competition Commissioner to deal with the Act. And yes, there are some concerns expressed that, well, we don't really know what the Competition Commissioner is going to do with this new toolkit, but effectively, those are the same kinds of concerns that come about whenever you pass a new law. You don't necessarily know how a judge is going to interpret it. You don't necessarily know how a tribunal is going to administer it. I think we have some ability to trust the enforcement of competition law in Canada and trust the discretion of the Competition Commissioner to exercise the powers wisely. And I say, let's give them the powers to be able to deal with competition in this economy in a 21st century manner, not in something that will saddle.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Janigan. Thank you, Mr. McCallum. We'll go Mr. Carrière.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Welcome to our committee, the last sitting of the day. I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Laliberté, who represents the Quebec, the Fédération des travailleurs et travailleuses du Québec. I would like to know how many people you represent. We represent 450,000 workers. Thank you. I see here that you consider both men and women workers, but you did not talk about pay equity, which was included in our draft budget, and this will now be included in the negotiations. As Mr. Olson said earlier, he would be willing for this to be negotiated, but I have always thought that equal work deserved equal payment. This was a right. How can you negotiate such a right? I wanted to know what you think about that, as you are directly concerned.
For us, the answer is very clear. For us, this transcends the whole question of collective bargaining. For us, it's not something you can negotiate. Because here we're speaking of patterns of discrimination in employment that have existed for decades. You know, it's been 80 years today that women became people under the law. And in work, there are certain categories of work which have been reserved, either for men or women. And so there are structural effects of discrimination that cannot be settled in a session of bargaining within a workplace. Because we have jobs related to this job site, so you have to find comparisons often outside, you have to make analysis, and we believe that it's comparing apples to oranges to talk of negotiating rights. That is why I would like to implore the government to pull this out of the bill, and if they don't, I would like to implore the Liberals to put their principles in front of their political interests and vote against this bill. Because here we're talking of questions of principle, basic fundamental rights, and we don't see how they can't see that. We believe this is something that cannot be negotiated. You can always debate whether program X or Y should have more resources, but in this case, it's serious. I would simply like to make a comment because your colleague extended or asked me if Quebec lost in this budgetary exercise. If that's the way you'd ask the question, I would have said yes. About equalization, for example, we can't understand how the Canadian government, who spent the equivalent of $18 billion in tax cuts and so on, does not have the means of giving $2 billion that it had already agreed to give in a 5-year agreement, when all the provinces below the average will be suffering greatly from the economic crisis. So for us, there's a fundamental problem here. And when we speak of things not related to the budget, we also speak of the centralization of the, as they say in English, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We have a securities commissions at work, so it ain't broken, why fix it? Last question. How do you judge the fact that we're going backwards including this in collective bargaining instead of considering it as a right, the whole question of pay equity. Now, why is it possible for this Conservative government, supported by Liberals, to impose this rollback? The Liberals are saying, well, we have to accept certain compromises because of the economic situation. But how can we have this rollback? I will bet you that our Conservative friends will see the light, and that our Liberal friends will also see this as being a question of principle that merits. Thank you.
Please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Olson. It seems to me that truly equitable compensation can really only occur when all parties are working together. And it appears to me that the current approach is rooted in an adversarial system. And in my opinion, it's time to change that system. As many know, I was a lawyer in private practice for 25 years before being elected to government. And although I didn't practice in the area of labor and employment law, I certainly had many partners who did, and I suppose I benefited indirectly from their many great efforts and long efforts on behalf of some of their clients over the years. And I wonder if you could comment on some of the court cases that have occurred in the past, and specifically on how long they've lasted, how much money has been spent on lawyers and such other fees, and I hope my former partners aren't watching this evening.
All right. Let me talk about one that I am most familiar, and that is the litigation between the Public Service Alliance of Canada and Canada Post Corporation. The Public Service Alliance of Canada filed a complaint in 1983 complaining that the white-collar clerical employees that they represented did work of equal value to the blue-collar postal clerks that worked in our postal plants. By the way, they were gender neutral. So we had a female predominant group, white-collar. We had a gender neutral group in our plants, 50-50 men and women of about 20,000. And then to make sure that the group was predominantly male, they added the letter carriers into the, which was in a different union at the time. In any event, that case was in investigation for 13 years. It was finally referred to tribunal in about 1995. It lasted 10 years before tribunal. It was then reviewed by the Federal Court Trial Division. Okay? And it was Canada Post contended it had not discriminated by paying unequal wages for work of equal value. The tribunal found the evidence to be very deficient after 10 years of litigation, but nevertheless awarded, but they said because the evidence was so bad, they would only award 50% of the amount claimed. The Federal Court Trial Division, where it currently sits, reviewed the case, determined that the case had not been proved before tribunal, and sent it back to the tribunal to dismiss the file. But, and interestingly enough, I thought I might get some questions about it, but here's what Mr. Justice Kellen of the Federal Court Trial Division said about the lengthy litigation process and how that was a terrible way to resolve these kinds of disputes. I have to say that this case is now under appeal again and will likely be heard in the Federal Court of Appeal in the fall of this year. But But as it stands, until this decision is set aside, Mr. Justice Kellen of the Federal Court Trial Division has ruled that the complaint had not been proved, that the evidence was not satisfactory, and he had this to say about the process. Within the first year of the hearing before the tribunal, the evidence upon which the Public Service Alliance of Canada complaint was referred by the Commission to Tribunal was found deficient and of no value. This is at the end of the first year of hearing. At that point, all the parties and the tribunal recognized that the evidence did not substantiate the complaint. The tribunal has the legal duty, if it finds that the complaint to which the inquiry relates has not been substantiated, to dismiss the complaint under subsection 53(1) of the Canadian Human Rights Act. However, in this case, the tribunal allowed the Public Service Alliance of Canada to retain new experts to marshal new evidence in an attempt to substantiate the complaint. Marshalling of the evidence took place over several years, and each time the evidence was found to be deficient. The hearing was then adjourned or ended to allow the Alliance to repair or buttress the deficient evidence. And he says, in my view, the tribunal breached its duty under Section 53 of the Act and breached the duty to provide parties with a fair hearing. A fair hearing is not a continuing process. A fair hearing is one where a party knows the case against it and has an opportunity of addressing that case within a reasonable time. At that point, the tribunal has a duty to adjudicate upon the case. And then he concludes that the evidence the case had not been proved at tribunal, and sent it back to be dismissed. Now, what I have to say is,
Mr. Olson, I'm sorry, Mr. Deckard's time is up, though. So
could I just clarify one point? Okay, just to say, now, this case that is still outstanding after 25 years deals with the past situation. I will tell you that the Public Service Alliance of Canada and Canada Post sat down in 2002 and resolved all issues concerning equal pay for work of equal value in collective bargaining. Okay? And
okay, Mr. Olson,
thank you.
I'm sorry to break that up, but we'll finish with Mr. McKay, please.
Mr. LaLiberte, I just wanted to ask you a question about unemployment insurance or employment insurances now. You made several points about access to the program, that you thought that access should be improved. The government's probably done the least amount possible, namely stacking 5 hours on the end of the program. You know, shrinking the period, the 2-week period, down to 0. Those sorts of things. All of that costs significant sums of money. Would it be your view that, or the other thing that the government did was they froze the premiums for the year and called that a stimulus, which the parliamentary budget officer took exception to, saying that really wasn't stimulus. But, you know, given that the premiums will inevitably rise next year, or the cost, more accurately, the costs will inevitably rise next year because of the huge influx of people who will be unemployed. Is it your view that the cost of the program should be taken out of general revenues, or it should be taken out of premium revenue?
Well, I mean, to answer your question, I mean, we've always thought that, you know, the system as a whole would be best managed if it was, you know, managed by employers and unions and government together, right? You know, under the office with you know, enough money to go around. In other words, I mean, you know, this is a model that, you know, we have, like, you know, for a number of organizations in Quebec, for instance, that works relatively well. And helps to, you know, create consensus, you know, over policies. Now, in the current context, I mean, it would have to come from general revenues. I mean, you know, in the context that we're dealing with right now, I mean, it would be fiction to think that, you know, we could, you know, pay for
the premiums, the benefits that will be given out of, the premiums that are being paid, right? You know that. So, I think for the time being, what was supposed to hold under the new fiducie, I don't know what you call it in English, but
agency. Yeah.
Agency. Yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't hold water anymore, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we're disappointed that the $4 billion went to premiums rather than to benefits. Because that's essentially what it would have cost to have what we proposed, in terms of, allowing everyone in Canada to qualify equally, with the same, number of hours, something that would benefit people in Alberta just as well as, in Nova Scotia, to have 60% of the insurable, salary. You probably know that the average premium, the average benefit right now is $330, right? I mean, that's for people who will have to rely on this, who are used to making, better salaries.
Yeah, right now it's also about a $17 billion program, and so your position would be, your advice to the government would be, when the costs inevitably go up, those costs should be taken from the general revenues rather than from premium revenue. You would, and you're saying that as a temporary, but temporary around here becomes very permanent very quickly. So effectively, what you're saying is that premium revenue is frozen.
I'm trying to say a few things here. I think that premiums should not have been frozen, indeed, and the benefits should have been improved. One thing that we did, a number of groups in Quebec, all the union federations included, essentially proposed that changes be done for 2 or 3 years with a sunset clause, in such a way that to weather the storm while it happens, and then not lock in future governments, even if we would wish that those improvements to be permanent, just to essentially put the government at ease with it. I mean, that suggestion was not entertained.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McKay. I want to thank all the witnesses for your presentations and for your responses, and I especially want to thank you for coming in at this time of night on such short notice. Colleagues, I just ask you to stay at the table, not the witnesses, colleagues, just stay at the table for a couple of minutes. I do want to thank all of you for the entire day you've put in here, your questions and your discussions here. We do have amendments to this piece of legislation, which will not surprise those of you who have sat through this session here today. So we do need a decision as to how we proceed with clause by clause. I'm proposing, we do have a regular committee tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'm actually proposing we start at 10 so we can have an extra hour in the morning. We do have, I believe, over 40 amendments that have been presented. We may have more. So my suggestion as your chair is to begin clause by clause at 10 a.m. I don't know how long that will take, but I assume it will be quite a fulsome discussion. So as your chair, that's my proposal, is that 10 a.m. tomorrow morning? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.